The radar contact appeared on a cold grey morning over the Barents Sea. A NATO maritime patrol crew, flying the edge of international waters north of Norway, watched a single shape pull away from the Russian coast. It was big, far too big. On their screens, it bloomed larger than anything else in the Northern Fleet. As their aircraft drew closer, the crew saw it with their own eyes through breaks in the cloud. A warship more than 800 feet long, knifing through the swell at over 30 knots, throwing white water from a bow built like a cliff face. This was Pyotr Velikiy, Peter the Great. The largest surface warship in the world that was not an aircraft carrier. And for almost 30 years, the sight of her leaving port set off quiet alarms in naval headquarters across Europe and the United States. The reason was simple. This one ship was built for a single terrifying job. She was designed to hunt down and destroy an American aircraft carrier and everything sailing around it. To understand why the world feared her, you have to understand what she carried. And to understand what she carried, you have to go back to a time when two superpowers were preparing for a war at sea that everyone prayed would never come. The story begins in the 1970s. The Soviet Union looked across the oceans and saw a problem it could not solve. The United States Navy ruled the seas with its aircraft carriers. Each carrier was a floating airfield carrying dozens of warplanes. A single American carrier group could project power thousands of miles from home. The Soviets had nothing like it. So Soviet planners asked a different question. They did not ask how to build carriers of their own. They asked how to kill the ones America already had. Their answer was the Kirov class. If you're an enthusiast of military technology and World War II, please consider subscribing to us. It would greatly help our channel. Thank you. The Russians called it Project 1144. The codename was Orlan, which means Sea Eagle. NATO did not know what to call it at first. These ships were too big to be cruisers and too heavily armed to be anything else. So Western analysts dusted off an old word from the early 20th century. They called them battlecruisers. It was the first time that word had been used for a new warship in more than 50 years. 4 of these giants were built over 2 decades. The fourth and final one was the most powerful of them all. She was laid down at a shipyard in Leningrad in 1986. She was launched in 1989, but then the world changed underneath her. The Soviet Union collapsed, money vanished, work on the ship slowed to a crawl, then nearly stopped. She had originally been named Yuri Andropov after a former leader of the Communist Party. In 1992, with the Soviet Union gone, she was given a new name. She became Pyotr Velikiy, Peter the Great, after the Tsar who built the Russian Navy from nothing 3 centuries earlier. It took 12 long years to finish her. She was finally commissioned into the Russian Navy on the 18th of April 1998. By then, the empire that dreamed her up no longer existed. She was a Cold War weapon born into a world that had moved on. But what a weapon she was. Let us start with what made her unusual before we even talk about her guns. Pyotr Velikiy did not run on fuel oil alone. At her heart sat 2 nuclear reactors. Those reactors gave her something almost no other surface warship in the world possessed. Unlimited range. She never had to stop for fuel. She could sail for months, limited only by the food in her holds and the endurance of her crew. More than 700 sailors lived aboard her. She was, in effect, a small steel town that could cross any ocean and never refuel. She was enormous, more than 250 meters from bow to stern. Fully loaded, she weighed around 26,000 tons. To put that in plain terms, an American destroyer of the same era weighed about 7,000 tons. An American cruiser weighed about 9,000. Pyotr Velikiy weighed more than both of them stacked together with room to spare. She was a moving fortress, and she bristled with weapons from one end to the other. The centerpiece, the reason she existed at all, sat hidden beneath her forward deck. 20 long launch tubes, angled and buried in the hull. Inside, each one weighted a missile called the P-700 Granite. NATO gave it a name that told you everything you needed to know. They called it the shipwreck. Each Granite missile was a monster in its own right. It was 10 meters long. It weighed about 7 tons. That is heavier than a small truck fired into the sky from a ship. Once launched, it could fly low across the waves at more than 2.5 times the speed of sound. It could strike a target nearly 300 miles away, and it carried a warhead weighing more than 1,500 pounds. But here is the part that kept Western admirals awake at night. The Granite could also be fitted with a nuclear warhead. A single one of these missiles, tipped with a nuclear charge, was powerful enough to destroy an aircraft carrier in one strike. One missile, one hit. Decades of American shipbuilding gone in a flash. And Pyotr Velikiy carried 20 of them. There was something even cleverer and more frightening about how they were meant to be used. The missiles were not designed to be fired one at a time. They were built to launch as a swarm. The Russians designed them to talk to each other in flight. One missile would climb high to act as a scout, scanning the sea with its radar. The others would skim low across the water where they were hard to detect. The high one would share what it saw with the rest. If that lead missile was shot down, another would automatically climb up to take its place. Together, they would pick out the largest, most valuable ship in an enemy formation and throw themselves at it as a coordinated pack. It was a hunting wolf pack made of steel and fire. That was the nightmare the Kirov class represented. A salvo of supersonic missiles, thinking as a group, bearing down on a carrier from 300 miles out. Of course, a ship that hunted carriers would itself be hunted. So Pyotr Velikiy was given one of the most powerful air defense systems ever put to sea. Buried in her decks were nearly 100 long-range surface-to-air missiles, drawn from the same family as the famous S-300 system used to guard cities on land. These could reach out and knock down enemy aircraft and incoming missiles from far away. Around them sat layer after layer of shorter-range missiles and rapid-fire guns, each one a backstop for the last. The idea was to build a wall of defense so deep that almost nothing could get through. She also carried a heavy gun on her stern, torpedoes for fighting submarines, rocket launchers to clear the water around her, and a hangar tucked below deck for helicopters. She had powerful radars mounted high on her masts, able to scan the sky and the sea for hundreds of miles in every direction. Put it all together, and you had a single ship that could fight aircraft, submarines, and other ships all at once, while sailing forever on nuclear power. There was simply nothing else like her afloat. The Western navies that tracked her knew it. That is why her name carried weight far beyond her actual numbers. When Pyotr Velikiy joined the fleet, she was sent north. She became the flagship of the Russian Northern Fleet, based at Severomorsk in the frozen waters near the Arctic Circle. The flagship is the proudest ship in a fleet, the one the admiral sails on, the one that represents everything the Navy wants the world to see. For Russia, in the difficult years after the Soviet collapse, Pyotr Velikiy was a symbol. She told the world that Russia was still a great naval power, that its claws were still sharp. Then came the morning that would mark her forever. In August of the year 2000, the Russian Navy gathered for its largest exercise in more than a decade. It was the first big show of strength since the old Union fell apart. Pyotr Velikiy sailed at the center of it all, the flagship, more than 30 ships moving around her. Among the submarines taking part was one of the Navy's proudest boats, a nuclear submarine named Kursk. On the 12th of August, the Kursk was scheduled to practice firing dummy torpedoes at Pyotr Velikiy. It was a routine training drill. The flagship was the target. The submarine was the hunter, It was the kind of mock battle navies run all the time, but that morning something went wrong aboard the submarine. At around 11:30, an explosion tore through the Kursk. Pyotr Velikiy felt the shock through the water. Her crew reported the disturbance, but in the confusion of the exercise, the warning was not understood for what it was. The Kursk was lost, with all 118 sailors aboard. It became one of the worst peacetime disasters in the history of the Russian Navy. In the days and months that followed, Pyotr Velikiy stood watch. During the long, painful operation to raise the wreck from the seabed the next year, the great flagship guarded the area where the submarine had gone down. By the time that chapter closed, she had sailed roughly 28,000 nautical miles. That is more than the distance around the entire planet. The flagship, built to project power, had instead spent her most public moment as a silent guardian over a national tragedy. She would go on to a long career of showing the flag. If you're an enthusiast of military technology and World War II, please consider subscribing to us. It would greatly help our channel. Thank you. Over the years that followed, Pyotr Velikiy roamed far from home. She sailed to the Caribbean and took part in joint drills with the Venezuelan Navy in 2008. The following year, she hunted pirates in the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Somalia, protecting merchant ships from attack. She cruised the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. Wherever she went, Western navies took notice and shadowed her. A nuclear-powered giant flying the Russian flag was always front-page news. She also took part in operations connected to Russia's involvement in the Syrian conflict, sailing as part of a group built around Russia's only aircraft carrier. She was decorated for her service. For more than 2 decades, she was the unmistakable face of Russian naval might. When Russia wanted the world to remember that it still ruled a piece of the ocean, it pointed to Pyotr Velikiy. And here is where the story turns, because the monster the world feared was, by then, already beginning to fade. A warship is a living thing in a strange way. It demands constant care. Steel rusts, engines wear out, electronics grow old and tired. Nuclear reactors need careful tending, and Pyotr Velikiy was built with technology from the dying days of the Soviet Union. Her great missiles, the mighty Granite, were designed in the 1970s. The world had moved on. New weapons were smaller, smarter, and easier to maintain. The huge angled tubes in her hull, once the cutting edge, were now aging relics. Her sister ships told the tale. Of the 4 Kirov-class battlecruisers ever built, the first 2 were quietly retired and broken up for scrap. They had become too expensive to keep alive. That left only 2 of these giants in existence. One was Pyotr Velikiy. The other was her sister, Admiral Nakhimov. Russia made a choice. Rather than keep both monsters running, it would pour its money into rebuilding just one of them. Admiral Nakhimov was sent into the shipyard for the deepest, most complete overhaul imaginable. The plan was to strip her down to bare metal and rebuild her for the modern age. Out would come the old granite tubes. In would go modern vertical launchers able to fire a whole family of new missiles, including supersonic and even hypersonic weapons that fly so fast they are nearly impossible to stop. It was a stunning plan on paper. It would turn the old Cold War relic into something genuinely new. The trouble was the cost and the time. Work crawled on for year after year. Deadlines came and went. By the time the rebuilt Admiral Nakhimov finally went to sea for trials in 2025, the project had swallowed an estimated $5 billion and taken more than 20 years. Some analysts pointed out that by the time she returned to the fleet, the very idea behind her might already be out of date. And what of Pyotr Velikiy through all of this? She kept sailing for a while as the flagship, but her time was running short. The plan was for the newly rebuilt Nakhimov to take over as flagship of the Northern Fleet and for Pyotr Velikiy to go into the yard for her own deep overhaul. That overhaul never came. Quietly, around the early 2020s, Pyotr Velikiy stopped going to sea. She was tied up at her base in the far north. Reports began to circulate that the Navy was thinking of retiring her instead of rebuilding her. Russian officials denied it at first. They insisted she was still in service, still being prepared for repairs and upgrades. But the upgrades did not materialize. The years ticked by, and the great flagship sat at her moorings. By the spring of 2025, satellite images told the story without a single word. A photograph taken from space showed the mighty battlecruiser sitting motionless in a bay near her base. Analysts who study these things noted that she had not deployed to sea since the summer of 2023. The hunter of carriers had become a fixture of the dockside. Reports indicated that Russia had cancelled its plans to modernize her at all. In August of 2025, a retired Russian admiral named Sergei Avakiants, who had once commanded Russia's Pacific Fleet, spoke plainly about her in an interview. He argued that spending the enormous sums needed to repair Pyotr Velikiy would be a waste of the country's money. That same money, he said, would be far better spent building several modern, smaller warships armed with up-to-date weapons. He went further. He suggested that the whole idea of these giant nuclear cruisers no longer made sense. They cost too much. They delivered too little for the price. It was a remarkable thing to hear. A senior Russian naval figure looking at the pride of the fleet and calling her, in effect, a beautiful mistake. There was a deeper reason for the doubts, and it came from the war in Ukraine. That conflict showed the world, in brutal fashion, just how vulnerable big warships had become. Modern anti-ship missiles and cheap drones proved able to threaten vessels that everyone had assumed were safe. Russia lost the flagship of its Black Sea fleet, the cruiser Moskva, to missile strikes. Suddenly, the question hanging over Pyotr Velikiy was uncomfortable. In a real war, would this enormous, slow-moving, aging target be a fearsome weapon? Or would she simply be the biggest, most expensive thing in the sky for an enemy missile to find? That is the strange truth at the heart of this story. Pyotr Velikiy was, on paper, one of the most powerful surface warships ever built by any nation. She carried enough firepower to threaten an entire carrier group. She could sail the world forever on nuclear power. Her name alone made navies pay attention for nearly 30 years. And yet, in all that time, she never fired a shot in anger at the carriers she was built to kill. The great war between the superpowers that she was designed for never happened. The thing the world feared most about her was always a thing that might be, never a thing that was. She spent her career as a symbol of Soviet ambition, of Russian pride, of a vision of naval power from a vanished age. She guarded a sunken submarine. She chased pirates. She sailed into foreign ports to remind the world that Russia was still there. She did everything a flagship is supposed to do, except the one violent thing she was actually built for. And now she sits silent in the cold northern water. The reactors that could have carried her around the world many times over lie quiet. The 20 granite tubes in her bow, those wolves of steel that once haunted the dreams of Western admirals, point at nothing. Her future hangs between two endings. She may yet be towed into a yard and rebuilt like her sister at enormous cost. Or she may follow her two scrapped sisters to the breakers, cut apart for the value of her metal. Either way, the era she belonged to is over. The age of the giant gun and missile battle wagon, the floating fortress meant to slug it out with the enemy on the open sea, has passed. The future of war at sea is being written by smaller ships, by submarines, by drones, and by missiles that fly faster than anyone in the 1970s could have imagined. Pyotr Velikiy was the last and greatest of her kind, a nuclear-powered colossus, conceived in fear, built across the collapse of an empire, feared for decades, and finally overtaken by the very march of technology that gave her birth. The world feared the monster. In the end, the monster's greatest enemy was not a carrier or a missile or a rival navy. It was time, and against time, even Peter the Great could not win.